Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today, I am Adam Parks here with another webinar for Receivables Info. We're going to talk about selecting accounts for litigation. And for this discussion, I brought on two very good experts with different perspectives on how accounts are selected for litigation and how to optimize that process, especially as we talk about getting into a time period where we're expecting a large new volume of accounts to be hitting the marketplace, and we're going to have to find those ways to better use the tools that we have at hand. And today, to help us with that discussion, we have Pete Klippa, who is with Harvest Strategy Group, and Greg Dye with Markoff Law. I apologize for my eyes floating all over the place. My regular camera is not working today, so we're looking at a few different screens. But gentlemen, just to kind of kick things off and to give everyone a little bit of perspective on kind of your approach, could you tell, let's start with Pete, but could you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to the seat you're in today?
Absolutely. Hi, everybody. Pete Klippa. I am the Chief Operating Officer for Harvest Strategy Group, and I've been in this role for about a year. I've served in a number of different collections and recovery roles at original creditors and also in the nonprofit sector over the last 25 years or so, and had an opportunity to kind of, work on credit card debt and work in the credit counseling environment, also in the auto space, in subprime auto, and also in the public utility receivable area. So have several different verticals, in my background. And, obviously we like to monitor all those economic directions, because they are sometimes indicative of where portfolios are moving in this space. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more as we go through the webinar today.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the intro. Greg, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself and how you got to the seat that you're in today?
Yeah, I sure can. So as you said, I'm Greg Dye with Markoff Law. Markoff, the firm, was founded back in 1980. We do collections and litigation services and judgment enforcements. We cover a good chunk of the Midwest. The firm is headquartered in Chicago, Illinois, but we have regional offices in Wisconsin, Michigan, Kentucky, and Ohio. I sit in the Michigan office. On a personal level, I've been in the industry about 25 years. I've held about every position an attorney can hold in a collections firm, from associate to compliance officer to president. My most unique experience is probably a couple of years at a fintech online lender where I served as compliance and learned a lot about underwriting and did a lot of front-end compliance. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective of seeing it from the front end long before we're trying to collect on it.
Fair. It sounds like we've got a great mix of perspectives today for this discussion, which
and I will say, Adam, if I could add one thing, I also apparently missed the memo about no tie required, and Pete missed the memo about shorts and short sleeves being okay.
Yeah, so look, I'm a Florida guy, and I tend to be a little bit more casual. I only wear a tie if I'm before a court or Congress. It's kind of my steadfast rule. No, but I really appreciate you guys coming on today. I think that your knowledge and perspectives are going to be very valuable to our discussion. So the first thing, and I think it's important that we address the elephant in the room, which is the litigation volume increase that is expected. And so in our current economic environment, I think we're all in a position where we're going, okay, the bubble is coming, right? For those of you that have read the Forrester report that TransUnion did recently, and looking at some of the vintage curves for automotive and just how some of these things are starting to grow into the delinquency stages, is concerning. And with that, I think we always talk about the balance of collectability, like liquidation, and the price of accounts, right? And that always tends to be this inverse relationship over time. And I think that I'm hoping that remains true as we go through this next economic cycle. But what are you guys seeing from an economic environment standpoint? What are the things that lead you to believe that this increase is coming?
Sure. So, Harvest is a network manager and a consultant to a variety of clients, in the auto space, credit card, debt buyers. We count as our clients. So we're watching things closely in those verticals for sure. And we're seeing, more breakage in the auto space than we are in the credit card space. And, we're driven by subprime in that increase than, say, in prime. Just to give you guys a feel for the numbers, we're even seeing it break a little bit across demographics. So younger people are showing more delinquency and charge-off breakage in recent months. And while the auto space overall is about even with where we were pre-COVID, we're seeing increases, as much as, 10-15% compared to the COVID periods in the younger demographics in auto. And even though it seems to be leading the credit card space a little bit with some of that delinquency increase in the so-called bubble, credit cards are moving up too. And we feel like it's right behind because there's pressure overall for consumers. Inflation is part of it. The erosion of savings is something that we're tracking, and that's part of it. And, we just need to be prepared because we're heading into that environment where there'll be more receivables in the coming, 12 to 24 months.
I think one of the big concerns that you pointed out there in the auto space is something that's a driving concern for me personally. I look at the auto marketplace, I look at the price of used vehicles, and I say there comes a point in time where the metal on the street does not offset what has been lent on these vehicles. And I think as you start to get to that point, one, the banks end up having to put more cash to meet their Federal Reserve requirements, right? So like when they realize that there's not enough assets to offset this, their Federal Reserve requirements are going to change. And I think that's something to be aware of. And a lot of the banks were able to quickly recover financially from the pandemic, and they were able to they wrote off all these losses that they ultimately trickled back into their balance sheets or back into their P&Ls over, let's call it a 2 to 3 year period. My concern right now is the inventory of these used cars. If you look at Carvana and CarMax, for example, which are both organizations that are holding, I believe it's around 450,000 vehicles in inventory between the two, and both have come very, very close to bankruptcy. And I believe there's been some VC funds that have come in and tried to prop those organizations up, but at the rate that they were losing money, I don't know. I don't particularly understand why to make that investment a second time. But what happens if all those cars hit the street? Right? If one of those organizations goes down, the entire used car market tanks, which means the other organization goes down, and you start to look at the automotive lending on the whole as not as strong as it has been in the past. And I think the complication on the auto side with that increase of expected volume would be the management of the documentation required to collect on a deficiency balance. Right? Like there's a lot of documentation, a lot of steps and processes that need to happen. And I wonder if the auto lenders are prepared to handle that volume of documentation.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, with auto, there certainly is a bubble that's out there that was driven up by, issues with supply and demand as it related to both new and used cars, coming out of the COVID environment. So, we're very much living with that in these days. And you look at the year over year, auto delinquencies greater than 90 are up about 50% just in 1 year's time. And they're exceeding now those pre-COVID levels, even though credit card hasn't quite gotten there yet on the pre-COVID. So it's just exacerbated the younger the demographic goes. If you look at the 18 to 29 year old bracket, it's well over 50% in the year over year increase. And of course, those folks are looking to get into first cars and that sort of thing. So the other piece of this that is sort of economic and labor driven is what's happening with repossession. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to get repo agents. This is another, report to the job site kind of work that you have to be there where the cars are. And, with people increasingly looking to work from home, there's pressure on getting those folks to do what is a very difficult job. So, the auto lenders are feeling it, and they're trying to work through that, as best they can. But in some cases they're turning, to legal collections to help secure the position in those deficiency balances.
Sure. And Greg, I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of where we go with student loans, right? Like we've seen what's in the news that they're going to reinstate the student loans. That's the expectation at this time. I find it a little hard to believe that anyone's going to start trying to collect money going into an election cycle, but that's just what my gut tells me. What are you thinking and hearing?
Well, not to steal Pete's thought, but Pete said something very interesting during our prep call, really related to financial literacy. And I think it goes beyond student loans, right? There was a lot of money available over the last however many years, whether that was people getting stimulus money or extensions of unemployment. And Pete's comment was nobody kept that money in their budget for their cars or their student loans. They went and upgraded something or spent it on something else, kind of living for the moment. So you have this situation where, as we're coming out of that, people are certainly trying to struggle as to how I get that money back in my budget. And I think that's probably the bigger issue with student loans, but I don't think it stops at student loans. And, what, as you mentioned, the auto market too, I mean, the average car payment right now is up over $700 for a vehicle. There is so much focus on mobility and connectivity and putting a lot of bells and whistles in the car. And I don't want to get off on a tangent, but nobody's building a car that somebody can afford to buy at this point in time. And, the sales guy is not going to help anybody with the overall cost of that. They're going to try to get that monthly payment and stretch it. So I think there's a lot of issues with, everybody's budget and how they manage their money has been sort of in upheaval for the last 3 or 4 years. And now we're trying to get back to a normal situation where people are having the money to have cars and credit cards and student loans. And I think people are going to struggle about how to make all that happen. And that's going to have an impact in leading to things falling into default in that regard. I think there's a lot to do with that.
I think you bring up a lot of good points, which also brings us on to talking about old volume that's starting to come to the surface, right? All these accounts that either couldn't get litigated because courts were shut down or the timing of whatever. But now it feels like we're getting closer to a tipping point of that volume just kind of opening up into the marketplace. If I remember correctly, I believe it was Texas is currently exploring opening a court system that is specific to the collections marketplace. So I think that some entities, states, geolocations, whatever you want to call them, are starting to look at how are they going to handle this volume that's going to come flooding through. And then I think you have other jurisdictions that are probably going to leverage this as a political opportunity to restrict the volume and flow, not increasing their infrastructure to push these cases through. So we're going to have to get smarter and more accurate in the way that we select accounts for litigation. Does it sound like a fair statement, gentlemen?
Yeah, without a doubt. There's some inventory that kind of went through during the COVID period that perhaps wasn't maximized as a result of just dealing with the uncertainty. There was a stand down position in some cases with creditors. There were court interruptions. It was sort of business as unusual. But we know, heading into the volume environment that we're headed into, it's important, to get assessment and cleanup of those accounts that maybe are a little bit more dated, because the volume environment is such that there's going to be so much flowing through. It's important that we give that the best effort that we can. And one of the things we try to do at Harvest is just to challenge our vendors to max out on the legal inventory at all phases of the life cycle. So, we're looking at that work effort activity at pre-suit, into the suit process, and then, even on post-judgment, what does the effort level as well as the outcome level look like that, would be considered, maximum effort. If we can do that, we feel like it puts us in the best position to succeed, for our clients.
Fair. And I think as we talk about the challenges of managing this volume, right? Greg, you're still actively involved on the law firm side. Like, what are you seeing in the courts?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is different, right? It used to be pretty static. If somebody like Harvest would come to their firms and say, hey, where are your pain points? It would stay pretty similar. But now I think it's broader, right? New programs came into place. And to give you an anecdote, certainly in Chicago, they have a program called the Early Resolution Program, which which requires a referral to legal assistance. And that takes 2 extra court appearances in order to get that case moved to the regular courtroom. So you're looking at lengthy delays in that regard. There are courts here in Michigan that just don't have the capacity to process the paperwork, that may be months behind. So while I think it used to be pretty simple of saying, hey, this is a bad jurisdiction, this is a costly jurisdiction, this is a difficult judge, I think it's a lot more fluid now and not as static as it used to be. So it takes the firms or a network like Harvest to really be light on their feet in order to move that stuff into the best appropriate courts and places and be able to provide that information as to what the best course of action would be when you get to filtration, right? Filtration versus scoring could almost be at the top of the slide, right? There's scoring models, but I think the filtration has become a lot more complicated with a lot more courts doing things differently as to how they move the cases to judgment, and legislation and rules around assisting folks.
I think that's all really good insights. We did have a question come through in the chat, and I did forget to say at the beginning, if anybody has questions or comments, throughout, feel free to drop those in the chat. We try to respond to those as we go through the presentation, because honestly, interacting with the audience, far more fun than, talking about the slides. So I feel like the first question here is a pretty good one. This came in saying, so do you relax suit criteria with this aging inventory? Normal logic being you try to sue when you've identified a channel of liquidation, a job, an asset, etc. But as this inventory ages, what is the value and decision criteria of pursuing to preserve statute? That's a great question.
It is a great question. I can take a shot at that. So, at Harvest, we have a pro score model that we use that helps us for determination of the very thing that the question asked, suit criteria, return on cost as it relates to the suit decision. That is a model that's been in place at Harvest for the entire life of our company, over 15 years. And it really is integrated into our day-to-day work, with our clients. I might answer the first part of that question. Do you relax suit criteria? It's almost like you might relax settlement criteria, especially for that dated inventory, because in some cases you need to move that forward and get some consideration, maybe meeting that customer where they need to be in order to avoid involuntary actions, or further attempts at involuntary, with the consumer, depending on whether it's been sued or been moved all the way to judgment. But having that ability to understand that return on cost, it's still important, even with aged inventory. You can't move into those things blindly. You want to be as informed as you can be. And, at Harvest, I think we're at our best when we have our clients utilizing our pro score in the day-to-day strategy. Others use it maybe as a litmus test against their own scoring, and that's okay too. The more information you can have to make these decisions, we feel like the better it is ultimately to maximize return.
Yeah, and I would, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to add to that. Yeah, certainly we'll talk a little bit later about how the scoring models have gotten much more sophisticated, but it also depends on what investment the creditor is willing to make and over what amount of time. Like if you have a lot coming up to stat, but you're interested in you're right, the judgment expiration times are significantly longer, a decade plus in most states. So are you willing to put it into the legal stream now so that you can still sell it 3 or 4 or 5 years later because you have a judgment, or are you willing to keep trying to collect on that for a number of years? So while you may not, relaxing the suit criteria, it might allow you to preserve the stat or really extend it, because now you might have a decade before the judgment expires, and maybe that's something that can be sold or collected on down the road. So I think there's some factor into how long the creditor is willing to wait on that cost return.
Well, I think to me that goes back to, again, something that Pete said on the planning call, which was kind of talking about how you're measuring the return on court costs, right? There's the creditor's looking at return on investment, and there's a number of different factors that we look at when we're determining whether or not we want to make an investment. But I think it's interesting that you're looking at it from the perspective of what is the return on these court costs, because I feel like that's a criteria that is often overlooked.
Court costs are always changing. We
That's a good way to put it.
We talked about the environment in the courts now, and this isn't that unlike what's happening, with repossession, where there's some difficulty from a staffing standpoint. Let's face it, our unemployment is extremely low, and these are mostly in-person jobs, although some of the courts are modifying that a little bit to allow for non-appearance at the courtroom, electronic and phone trials and things like that. But at the end of the day, it's still a courtroom. It's still people going in. There's still people who have to decide to go into that job every day. And, courtrooms are feeling that pressure because they've got a staff and they got to pay people at a level that they need to pay them. And, if there's less cases like we've been doing, through the COVID time period, that's not necessarily filling their coffers where they need to be in order to staff at the levels they need to, especially for this upcoming volume. So all that being said, there's trade-offs that are happening all the time with cost. And sometimes, there's pressure for courtrooms to raise those costs, which give us a reconsideration of that return on cost at the individual jurisdictional level. That's something we try to manage in partnership with our law firms so that we have a pulse of what's going on out there in the day-to-day. And, there's always strategic considerations, suing at a higher court, suing at a lower court, depending on what those outcomes are, that could help dictate, some of those decisions. So we try to partner, with both our vendors as well as our clients to help navigate that strategy for the best possible option and outcome.
I think it's an interesting approach, especially as you're looking at these cash flows, right? If there's one thing I took out of college, it was the same statement that I feel like this professor said over and over and over again, which was there's three things that matter: the cash flow, the timing of the cash flow, and the risk associated with that cash flow. And I feel like this is no different, right? Like you have to look at what cash flows can I draw from these accounts, right? What's the timing of me being able to draw the cash flow from these accounts if I'm willing to invest in these court costs? And then what risks do I have associated with spending that money, right? Like I may not get this judgment or we may get a judgment, not be into selling our judgments and not being able to collect on it. So I think from that perspective, we start talking about injecting new data and all kinds of other things that can ultimately become part of that process as you're looking to select which accounts you're ultimately going to litigate on. And I think, you guys had some really interesting thoughts when it came to the prioritization of accounts for litigation, right? And how are we, now that if we're going to have this big volume, how are we creating a prioritization within that volume to make sure that we're focusing our efforts on the right accounts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the type of thing where, we attempt to measure, the touch points on accounts, throughout the life cycle. Harvest has a very evolved exceptions process. So from a reporting standpoint, we're able to determine, the level of work and activity that's occurring on accounts. And, if we see things that are stagnant, there's certainly intervention activity that occurs so that we're making sure that, nothing sits for any length of period too long. These exceptions are documented, in our attorney and agency network guides, which, allow for us to set the expectation, for vendors around the cadence at which these things need to be kept fresh. So that doesn't change, in an environment when the account placements increase. We see that from time to time with certain clients where the volumes are up. And, we mentioned it earlier in the call, we're seeing that in different pockets and verticals, but, same rules apply, and it may cause firms to need to staff up in order to, meet those requirements consistent with how the volume's changing. So that's how we manage it. And, we'd like to think that that helps us, stay on top of the inventory and we're getting the most out of it.
I think that's some fair statements there. Greg, from your perspective, and I know that there's not a steadfast answer for this one, but where do you start, with the backlog or the fresher inventory?
Yeah, I think it depends on, what capacity you have, what kind of costs you're willing to put forward. This, getting back to the question online, a little bit about suit criteria, it's become a lot more sophisticated, and the modeling and the data science has become a lot more sophisticated, right? I used to sit and an attorney would look at a file and, oh, there's a job, or the credit bureau looks okay, and make an individual file by file decision on sue criteria. Now, I think, and I'm getting a little ahead of us, but I told you guys a little anecdote on our prep call about, when I worked at a lender, there was a data scientist who was predicting current accounts that were going to default in the next 90 days. And it was an incredible level of accuracy. And so, and I also mentioned sometimes the suit decision now is being pulled out of the attorney's hands. And I think there's a couple of reasons, right? We have a small data set. What I would have as an attorney looking at a file, trying to determine suit criteria, do I have a job on file? Do I have a bank? Does the bureau look okay? But then you get to a place like Harvest, you have a broader set of data. You have more data to look at to kind of set that criteria. And going back from Harvest to a very sophisticated creditor, you may actually employ a data scientist who creates that model. So I think aging is certainly, my knee jerk is go get the fresh stuff, right? That's the data that's most important. And I think that's what, if you told me I had to make a decision right now, I would say, get the fresh stuff, because that's the stuff that's more likely to collect on. Those are the addresses that are going to be better. But I do think there's some you got to give some credence to how sophisticated the creditor might be. They might have their own model that has a much broader data set that we can handle. And then, like I said, certainly Harvest would have a better data set than what we're seeing in 4 or 5 states. So I think there's some level of who the creditor is and how sophisticated their scoring model could be. But I do see that information these days being more just delivered, like, right, you're going to send the file to the attorney to sue, because we've taken care of that for you. And we'll talk later about some compliance reasons that's important as well.
Sure, and I can actually see in our attendance today at least one particular organization that only sends accounts out to an attorney network if they're prepared for litigation. Like, they send them the whole package up front, like, here's what we need you to go do, which I think is interesting. Now, as we talk about these models, there's a couple different ways that I've seen people approaching kind of their prioritization. I would say, and I didn't put together a graphic for this, but I was kind of thinking my way through it on the whiteboard last night in a different context, but looking at things in terms of, so if I've got this massive amount of data, right? First, peeling off everything that's an exclusion, whatever my exclusion criteria is, right? And Pete, it sounds like you guys have got that down to a science, but whatever that exclusion criteria is, from a massive amount of information, first, wipe away those that are just not going to be a fit. Why are you going to spend another penny on data or thought process or another second of your life thinking about that account? Push those off to the side if they're an exclusion. Then we look at prioritization. So once we've gone from that idea of we've wiped away the exclusions, now we can look at and run contextual filtering that would enable us to prioritize specific accounts over other accounts, which one of the criteria in that prioritization may be the age of that inventory, the treatment of that inventory, the owning of assets. Because from what I heard from Greg was that the small attorneys are looking at things through a Boolean logic perspective, meaning they have a job, yes or no. Right? They have a car, yes or no. They have a home, yes or no. Right? But it's a lot of yes or no criteria that's ultimately being evaluated to make that decision. And then you start getting into more complex data science type projects where you're able to create that exclusion, create a prioritization, and then start to work through your standard workflows, however it is that you are viewing the world as an organization. And I do think with the rise of more chief strategy officers that I've seen popping up around the space over the past, call it 2 to 3 years, I could think of 3 or 4 off the top of my head. I think you're seeing more of that. And I think a good chunk of some of these changes that we're seeing on an organization by organizational basis is based on those criteria that they internally have developed for their standard workflow. But I think if you look at that top piece of your funnel and say, here's my exclusions, here's where I can prioritize, like, here's my low-hanging fruit, right? Let's go get some low-hanging fruit so that we got a snack while we're digging in after the more complex pieces. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Harvest does is, in the build of our model, we're considering of both internal data and external data. We try to bring that to bear in the decision. So, you ask yourself, what does that look like? We have a certain predicted state favorability score that comes out of the work that we do. And, we can compare that, from one portfolio to the next. And, we not only do that in the kind of upfront, assessment, but we're looking at it to see, hey, did it pay off this way on the back end, from a post-audit standpoint, because did it do what we expected it to do, and that helps me get a better model going forward because you're feeding it with updated data around that. We also look at that average on the court costs, because depending on the mix of the portfolio, it might be more heavily weighted to states that are going to be very costly. It doesn't mean that they aren't worth pursuing, but certain accounts may not be pursued in the same percentage depending on what that's telling us. And then another piece of this that we haven't really talked about is, does the portfolio have a connection in any way, shape, or form to debt settlement? That is the underwriting factor in so much of the things that we look at. And, let's face it, the debt settlement industry is the best underwriter there is out there when it comes to assessing consumers and entering them into those programs. They have to have a certain balance level. They have to have a certain monthly cash flow. And depending on the mix of accounts that go in there, it could be better to sue that account early, or it may be better to sit back and get into a part of the payment plan that will build as that trust account balance builds with debt settlement. So there's a trade-off there that very much breaks along balance and consumer responsiveness and the timing at which that cash flow begins to play out. So we're looking at all these things. These are factoring criteria, and that's just a few of the data elements, I guess, that are part of the consideration around prioritization.
Well, you're bringing up more questions for me, man. Like everything you're saying brings up more questions. Like it feels like there's, so when you're looking at the debt settlement space, right? Like debt settlement, and I've done a couple of Receivables Roundtable podcasts with, I believe it was Janine Jackson, who kind of comes from that debt settlement space, trying to help me better understand the uses and what that looks like from the consumer's perspective. So anybody who's interested, you can go back and watch those roundtables. But in my mind, a lot of the prioritization of workflow as it related to debt settlement has been related to the collection side of the business. Have you integrated that understanding? And I know that's more your background than mine, right? But like, have you integrated that understanding into your prioritization of selecting accounts for litigation?
Yeah, we absolutely have. The debt settlement consumer looks a lot like a consumer that would qualify for a mortgage. They just have a lot of the same demographic details, and debt settlement wouldn't take them unless they were that way. So that's a fact. That's been proven out in a number of studies, and we need to treat it that way. That consumer has liquid, so they're going to perform at a higher level, and it's important to understand kind of what that consumer is willing to do when it comes to how they're going to work with the creditors that they owe when it comes to those balances and where they sit with all the other balances that they may be trying to work through. So it's complex for sure, but in some cases it's important that you get there early, when there's a debt settlement consumer. In other cases, if the balances are smaller, you may be able to get some of those settled out early without significant investment on the court cost side. So it's not a perfect science, but we're trying to use the data that we have at our disposal to help guide those decisions. And of course, there's going to be breaks in states with that as well. So it's a even more sophisticated analysis when you start looking at it on a state by state.
Yeah, with debt settlement, you certainly might be able to, if you're willing to spend the money on cost, bump yourself to the top of the list, right? The model for debt settlement is not like the old credit counselors where you divvy up the money, and then when one creditor drops off, everybody gets a little bit more every month. They're holding money to try to do settlements, right? Because they're getting paid a percentage of what they settle for. So they're going to wait, and they're going to pick and choose who they're going to pay off. If you're willing to invest in litigating those cases, there's a good chance you're going to bump yourself higher on the priority list. A lot of debt settlement companies partner with attorneys to try to, let's stall the case out a little bit while we're still gaining the money to try to settle. But if there's active litigation, the customer of the debt settlement company might have a dozen accounts to try to settle, but you're gonna likely get to the top or near the top of that list if you have pending litigation.
Fair. Getting yourself prioritized. I like that. Getting yourself prioritized for payment.
Yeah, there's no doubt, and certain accounts end up settling out early in the debt settlement process based on balance. That's part of the way that the debt settlement companies try to, establish their value with the consumer by saying, hey, we'll get this $2,500 balance settled out, and that particular account may not, lend itself as well to legal, because of the size of the balance and depending on the state. So. That's one of the ways that debt settlement tries to get in there, because once they get one of those settled, then it gives the consumer a little bit of confidence in the staying power to stick around with it. But the reality is that most people that go into debt settlement, they don't complete their programs, and that part of it is difficult for a consumer, because sometimes they put a lot in and they don't get everything out of it that they were looking for. And sometimes the reason for that is because legal comes in and it breaks the agreement. If you get the suit and get the judgment, you may ultimately get the garnishment, and that makes it difficult from a cash flow standpoint for the consumer to continue to maintain those arrangements. So that's some of the trade-off that occurs a little later in the stage. once you get out to 12 months plus.
Yeah, and not to say the same thing again at the risk of that, but right, if you get a judgment. The debt settlement company is not being paid to go to trial on the case. They're getting paid a difference of what they save them. So they need to be highly motivated to settle that case. If they have a customer who gets a judgment against them and their bank account gets seized and frozen, they're not paying into the program anymore because somebody took that, and it's going to disrupt their entire program. So there is the cost of going into litigation on those, but I think it creates a heightened sense of urgency to get your account resolved one way or the other, because it'll just destroy their program if you somehow freeze a bank account or take funds that are going into the program.
It's very interesting. Now, just kind of a last point on this slide, and we'll move on. But when it comes to the statute of limitations, is there a line in the sand to where you're like, this account does not have enough time to go through? And I've heard different organizations with different timelines. I'm just curious to hear how you guys view it.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't like to push the envelope too much beyond that 6-month window as it relates to what remains. It just creates too much risk, and is thought to be best to back it off at that point.
Okay, understood. How about you, Greg? Any thoughts on the timeline?
Yeah, no, especially on a volume client, that's very, very fair. Certainly a one-off account, that a commercial account or something that's high balance, you can push those through and race it to the courthouse. That happens all the time. But as a general practice, I think Pete is right. You want time for a demand letter and the validation period to go, and for a firm to do all their diligence, get the letter out and do what they need to do before they push that in. So I think that's a fair amount.
Okay. Now, one of the things that we've talked about previously is kind of how are we preparing accounts or working accounts prior to litigation. And another trend that I've seen over the past couple of years is more law firms and organizations putting pre-suit recovery efforts in place, right? There was a time where attorneys did not generally have call centers, and now I feel like it's becoming more and more normal to see those. What are you guys seeing in terms of working with law firms that are taking on pre-suit recovery efforts, or do you feel that there's a preference in leveraging collection agencies prior to leveraging law firms?
This one is going to break a little bit along, balance and client expectations. They vary a little bit, from client to client. And of course, a larger balance will justify, a more committed effort on, a dedicated collector from staff, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. But, what we encourage our attorneys to do is to max out in this area if they can. We try to, monitor to that max out effort so that we can see that there's a commitment to this. Certainly on the pre-suit side, there's some court cost savings that can be had if a consumer can be moved into a payment status on the pre-suit. The other thing that's evolving here is what's going on in digital collections. And, this too is client driven, but we know in the months and years to come, this is going to continue to evolve, with the ability to use text messaging, ability to send certain letters out via email, and just having a portal, for where consumers can follow up and do some self-service as it relates to payment arrangements. This is ideal, for consumers that are looking to be serviced that way. They're getting this from their banks and lenders, and there's no reason why those options can't continue to expand in the legal collection space. One of the things that we've done at Harvest is try to take inventory of where we are with all things digital across our entire vendor base. And maybe no surprise, the collection agencies are a little bit further out in front on this, and there's some really sophisticated things that are going on the collection agency side as a best practice. So, we're talking to attorneys about their strategies and how they're enabling these things, talking to them about what they're doing with other clients, and maybe not by mentioning those clients' names, but understanding in general, what some of their bank clients are allowing them to do, because that certainly is going to get more adoption of these tools going forward.
I think that online self-service options is a major factor. I feel like the importance of that particular piece has been understated for years. Even going back 10 plus years, it's always been my kind of thought process, and I've got significant data to support it, managing over 100 websites in the receivables management space. But consumers want to be self-serviced, and consumers are more comfortable working with an organization that's offering them a similar experience to the one they had at the bank. So if they were with Bank of America or Chase that have solid online banking platforms, it's kind of their expectation when they're dealing with a collection agency or a vendor of that bank, right? They want to have that same kind of seamless online self-service experience. And I have seen that really push more and more into the legal realm. I know HealPay, for example, I believe is really focused on working with the law firm side, right, in terms of their payment portals and their payment processing, which I think is interesting that that's the specialty niche, because I've talked with attorneys in the past, and especially as I was brokering debt, where the attorneys really didn't want to have an online presence. They didn't really want to have an online portal or to even take payments, right, in a digital format. They were taking their payments as checks, and they were working to a little bit more of an old school model. But it feels like that has had a major catalyst over the last 5-6 years, to where I feel like everybody is starting to deploy those and to provide more opportunities. And maybe part of that is the data play. Part of that is just evolving with the times and the consumer preferences. And part of it may also just be the change in the mind frame from a debtor to a consumer, right? And although they're just words, that is a major shift that has happened over let's call it a 15-year period. Right? We had all these debtors. Now we have consumers. I literally, if someone says debtor on a phone call now, I'm almost like, oh, like, wait, what year is it? So I think it's interesting to see how this has started to evolve. Greg, from your perspective, is this something that you guys have experimented or taken a look at?
Well, yeah. So to summarize what you're kind of saying, pre-suit recovery efforts have always been about creating an interaction with the consumer. Right, and what's changing is the method of that interaction. Right, you said call centers or something kind of new. I've always been involved in law firms with call centers. It used to be just that, outbound calls, but now as technology has changed, that's not the interaction that more and more people are wanting. You see the emails and the texts and the online service. So it's still all about creating an interaction with the consumer. And I think firms and agencies have to evolve from dialing the phone as much because people aren't used to that. The lender that I worked for, nobody spoke to them before they got their loan. It was fully online. So that's the way they expect to be communicated with. The issue that comes up, and Pete mentioned that maybe some agencies are a little farther ahead. We're pretty good at phone calls. We know what all the regulations are. We know the disclosures we have to give. I'm sure that there's compliance officers listening that start to get heartburn when you go down the list of emails, text, self-service options, because nobody wants to be a pioneer. We'd rather read the suit decision from somebody else and follow it at that point in time. So I think it's slow going, at least for me, as to when are we comfortable blasting out text messages or emails, or having those self-service options? Are the disclosures where they need to be, and all of that, right? We're very skilled at phone calls. I think we need to get to the point where we're doing email, text, and self-service options, but I think it's still a little bit gray as to the risk to the firms, the creditors, and the industry as a whole. So hopefully we'll be smart about moving forward with all of that stuff, but it's definitely needed. It's what people want, and I think it's where things are headed for sure.
I think you'll also see some new tools that will make these compliance officers a little bit more comfortable with the text and the email. I haven't seen it in the text and email space yet, but I know, for example, CoinTech, led by Dara Tarkowski, has a tool set that does automatic letter review from a legal perspective. And so they're leveraging machine learning and other tool sets in order to review all of those letters. And I think as that technology gets adapted into the text messaging and into the email realm, hopefully it will quell the concerns of the compliance officers while also providing a better end user experience to the consumers that ultimately we're trying to serve.
Somebody would certainly like an app. Once you set up a payment plan, can I go into my Markoff app to make the payment? And maybe someday that's what happens. But I think we need to keep exploring those options.
I think that's an interesting piece, right? Like the apps versus the online web services, and will you actually download a debt collector's app to your phone and have that pre-exist versus shortcutting over to a website or web interface? I've had I'm not going to take the conversation down that path because that is an argument I've had on stage many a times. I've got my thoughts on it, but for our topic today, though, is we were talking about predicting results and kind of leveraging data science from a new perspective. And I know both of you have had some experience on the that kind of data side and building models that are very specific to this very specific purpose. Let's not pretend that we can take these models and go use them to predict airplane paths or anything else, right? Like, we are hyper focused on one particular thing. What are you guys seeing in terms of how data science and analytics are being used in new ways across the space?
Well, there's just so much interest in it, and it almost feels like everybody's doing something. They're either dabbling in it or they're in it great guns. And I think from our client base, we spend a lot of time really trying to understand what their needs are, as well as, what they're able to provide to us for detail that helps beget, good data, in the engine so that we can give them some predictive detail. So it's a customized approach in a lot of ways, depending on what they're able to provide. And, what we find is that a lot of our clients like that flexibility. They like the ability to be able to maybe test their own scoring against our scoring, or to maybe jump in and do some what if scenarios with data that don't require a whole lot of lift, but allow us to maybe do the lifting for them and then return that result to them so that they can help drive their strategy based on that predicted outcome. And what I like about it at Harvest is that we don't just give you a number and walk away from it. We say that's the number, and we're going to manage to that now going forward, and sort of hold ourselves accountable to that ongoing consultant expectation. Mm-hmm. So that's a piece that keeps us involved and keeps us accountable and our network accountable to sort of live by those results. So I think that that's where we're at our best when we're able to do that. It does require a degree of cooperation, commitment, but once you do that a few times, I think the clients get into that cadence and they're able to provide that support on a repeat basis.
That actually sounds very real. So, Greg, from your perspective, right, one of the things that you talked about was back in the day or in a previous life, actually manually selecting which accounts, right? Like, you're pulling up all these files and you're manually selecting it. And I had the opportunity to witness this in the 2007, 2008 crash as a consultant working for creditors to help them determine whether or not to take homes, right, in the mortgage foreclosure crisis. Do you think that methodology could even be done physically given the expected volume of accounts to come?
Yeah, probably not. And that's why I said I haven't sat and made a suit decision in a long, long time. Most of our clients, that's dictated to us. But, and not to get, so you talk about data science on the top of your list. And, I spent some time at a fintech company as a compliance person. And I've never been so impressed with somebody's job than data scientists. And it's mind blowing. So, and not to step away from our direct topic, but if you look at the underwriting process, every bank and lender is having to look to a way to apply the data science because the fintech companies are proving the model, right? They're not quite there yet, but they'll be there. So what used to take 2 weeks to get a loan, walking into a bank and sit down with a loan officer and go through the documentation, the company I was at could go application to funding in 4 hours.
Wow.
So and it was all small business lending, but if you had payroll due that day and you didn't have the money, you could apply at 8, be funded at noon, and keep your business afloat. Certainly the interest and the cost of that is a little bit higher at this point in time, but it could save your business. So I think as lenders continue to employ a ton of data science, we're a down the road vendor to those folks, and they're going to start to apply that eventually to the collections efforts that they make, right? That, like I said, at that company, they decided to give the resources of a data scientist to the collections department. And right, that's an expensive salary for a law firm, but the stuff that this guy would tell us was really mind blowing. And I think it's going to continue to go. Just to give you an anecdote, when you're getting a loan, there's Experian had a product called a fraud shield, and it would flag all these things and give you instructions, right? The underwriter's supposed to go ask for this document and clear all of these. But a data scientist is going in and doing it merely upon what is the combination of numbers of flags and which flags, studying that over time, and not going to the applicant and saying, oh, we need you to go get this document, we need to see that. They're just applying science to the hits, so you would say, from the various fields. And as that gets more and more accurate, the lenders are all going to look to either purchase those platforms or be able to do it because their customers are going to want to move a lot faster. And I say that because it will trickle down to collections. And there'll be an expectation of that. We're putting all this effort and information accurately into our underwriting and lending process. We want our collections to be the same way. And the predictive modeling, I think, will end up taking care of our suit criteria for us at some point down the road. Or, somebody, a network such as Harvest will be employing that long before it ever gets to a litigation standpoint. And not to belabor that, your next talks about there is a great concern about that, however, is there some discriminatory practice hidden in that model, unintended or not? And right now, that is a huge concern of regulators as to how is your compliance layering over a data science model, and is there something in there that's discriminatory? And that's something that they're going to have to deal with over time as well.
Yeah, we've run into this too on our side with really what would be client input as it relates to considerations within the model parameters. So, we'll work with clients on that. Different clients have different areas of interest, as it relates to this. And, we can make adjustments to the model if there are certain variables that, they may have concern about or want to know more about. So that flexibility, I think, is important because there's some variability, from bank to bank around what's priority as it relates to the details, within a model. And, all those things are going to be driven by the way they're regulated and things that may have come up in those regulatory discussions. So I think there's a need for a degree of flexibility as it relates to meeting, a certain bank client where they are with model development and enhancement.
Yeah, and the power of it is just incredible. It really, really is. I back to that anecdote of a current account. These are all business accounts, but it's current, and a prediction made that it's going to default in 90 days. Now, give that information to an old school collector, and he's going to say, what's that phone call look like? How are things at the coffee shop? Great, there's a line out the door. Well, it's not going to be that way in 90 days, so we'd like you to do something about your loan. But, we'll have to figure out what do you do with that type of stuff. But the power of data science, it just blows my mind, and just it'll keep improving and more to come.
Gentlemen, this is a rabbit hole that I could go down with you for hours. I don't know if you've watched some of our previous webinars and my podcast, but AI and the technology related to the receivables management industry is one of the big things for me. For those of you that are watching and were at the Debt Connection Symposium show last year, you got to see the decoding AI and financial services presentation along with the book written by Clara Durden. I highly suggest taking a look at that if you have an interest in artificial intelligence, the regulatory environment around it, and its application to financial services. If you can get your hands on a copy of that book, I know she flew over from London to give that presentation, but if you can find that, it is a very worthwhile read in terms of giving people perspective of how artificial intelligence is ultimately affecting our space. And gentlemen, although we didn't make it to our final slide here, we are out of time for today. I really did enjoy the presentation with you guys. For everybody that's watching, if you have anybody additional you'd like to share this content with, we'll be posting it to YouTube on Friday, so you can share that link out with the internal people or your friends across the industry to help them better understand some of the challenges that are being faced and some of the solutions available for selecting the right accounts for litigation and optimizing that process. But in the short term, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. This was an insightful discussion.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it,
Awesome, guys. Well, thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.